Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal Video Training, and this lesson covers how to install and configure desktop applications. This lesson covers Objective 2.2 of the Microsoft 70-687 certification exam, and the official objectives list these 5 sub-objectives: set compatibility mode, install and repair applications by using Windows Installer, configure default program settings, modify file associations, and manage AppV applications. This is going to be a very hands-on lesson, so let's get started with a demonstration of how to configure compatibility mode for desktop applications. Here's my Windows 8 Enterprise computer. I'll jump to the desktop because that's where the desktop apps live. Now you can see I've installed a single desktop app here that's not standard, and that's Google Chrome. So let's take a look at how to configure compatibility mode for it. I'll right-click the icon, then right-click the name of the app, and select Properties. Now on the App Properties dialog box, I just need to select the Compatibility tab to see the different compatibility options. Now, there's an automated wizard here called the Compatibility Troubleshooter, but before we walk through that, let's take a look at how to manually configure the settings. Now, first, you don't need to set compatibility for the vast majority of apps that exist. Most apps run in Windows 8 just fine, and in fact, Windows 8 comes pre-configured with compatibility settings for most of the common apps you see. Here's when you'll need to configure compatibility mode. If you work in an enterprise and they have some super old Windows or DOS apps, and you try them out in Windows 8 and they don't work properly. But they do work properly in an earlier version of Windows, for example, Windows XP. So what you do is you install it on the computer, and then you can right-click the icon and come in here to the compatibility settings. The first setting, and this pretty much gets the job done for most apps, is the compatibility mode. So you select this checkbox, and then you can choose this list. And what it does is it makes Windows 8 behave like the version of Windows that you select here. So what I like to do is to pick the most recent version of Windows that the app runs in perfectly. So you can look back at your other desktop computers and find somebody who could run the app successfully and check what version of Windows that they're running. Then select it here. Maybe it's Windows XP Service Pack 3. And that'll probably do the trick. You can just click OK and try and run it and see if it works. And if it does, you're golden. If it doesn't still work, we have some really old school compatibility settings. Reduced color mode. So the color mode is the number of bits, the number of different color combinations that Windows supports displaying. And by default, it supports displaying a 32-bit color, which is a whole mess of different colors, millions of different colors. Older versions of Windows only supported 16-bit color, which gives you like 65,000 different colors. And really old versions of Windows and DOS only supported 8-bit color, 256 colors that give you this kind of like chunky color range, and it didn't look very good. But if you find for some reason an app is getting confused by the color depth, if it's just not working properly, or if the graphics just look terrible, you can try selecting first 16-bit and then 8-bit color. Some old DOS apps are intended to run on a 640 by 480 screen resolution. Now, Windows 8 doesn't even support anything below 800 by 600, and 640 by 480, it's a lower resolution than most modern phones. That's a really tiny resolution, but that is the resolution that us old guys used in DOS for years and years and years. So if it's an old DOS app that needs to run in 640 by 480 and it doesn't work properly, you can select that checkbox and see if it works better. Now this checkbox here, disable display scaling on high DPI settings. Some modern computers have a really high DPI. That's the density of pixels on the screen. You hear about Apple's Retina displays that are at greater than 300 DPI. That's an example of a high DPI screen. At high DPI screens, you don't see individual pixels, like the pixels that curve the letter C here, no matter how close you get. At low DPI screens, you can see each individual pixel pretty clearly. So people enable display scaling on high DPI settings. Usually the computer manufacturer will have it enabled by default if a computer comes with a really high resolution monitor. And basically it just makes the text a little bit bigger, because if you had a really high resolution screen with a high DPI and it displayed the same dialog box, what would happen is all the text would be so tiny you'd have to squint. Like it'd be the same number of pixels high and wide. Each letter would be the same number of pixels high and wide. But because the screen's resolution is so high and the DPI is so high, the letters would be tiny. So, okay, that's what display scaling is. Some computers might have it turned on, and what will happen is when the app runs, the text will be all garbled up. So anyway, if you are using a high DPI setting on your computer and you see an old app that has the text kind of overlapping each other, just check that checkbox. Now this privilege level checkbox, this is probably the checkbox that you will select most often, and it's run this program as an administrator. So let me give you a little background here, a little history lesson if you're not an old guy like me. When Windows XP and earlier versions of Windows came out, app developers, they just assumed that everybody had full administrative privileges to their computer. So apps would do things like save log files in the Windows directory, or save user files in the program files folder, or they'd change settings. Sometimes they stored data in like protected portions of the registry. They weren't like doing anything naughty, but they weren't conforming with the modern standards. So because all apps had full privileges to the system, some app developers just took advantage of it and they were sloppy and they put stuff where they shouldn't. When Windows Vista came out, and these same settings were supported in Windows 7 and Windows 8, these three most recent operating systems don't allow most apps to have administrative privileges. So when you run an app in Vista, Windows 7, or Windows 8, they get standard user privileges, which means they can't go into the protected parts of the registry and mess it up. They can't write to the Windows system files. And that's a really good thing. It stops malware from doing those bad things, and it reduces the risk that some app will have a security vulnerability in it that other malware will take advantage of. So for that reason, apps don't run as an administrator by default, and that can cause old apps to mess up. If you have an old app and setting compatibility mode doesn't fix it, select that checkbox, test it. If it does work, well, that's your problem. Give the app developer a call maybe and get them to update their app so it can run without administrative privileges. But in the interim, you can leave that checkbox selected so that the app runs properly. Know that you're accepting some additional security risk if you run it as an administrator, and you also have to make sure that users have the proper privileges to run it as an administrator. So I'll disable these checkboxes and we can take a look at the compatibility troubleshooter. The compatibility troubleshooter is pretty smart. It will try running the app and checking the types of things that the app does. So if it sees that the app is trying to write to the program files folder, then it can adjust the settings so that the app can run properly. Now, this is just a simple wizard, and the certification exam isn't going to ask you specific questions about individual wizard options. Instead, they're going to make sure that you understand how to manually configure it. I just wanted to show you that the compatibility troubleshooter is here. The way I would usually use it is to run it and then try the recommended settings, see if it works properly. And if it does, you're golden. If it doesn't, you can go in and go through the troubleshoot program option here and just answer the questions that appear to see if it works properly. Honestly, I haven't had a lot of luck with this program compatibility troubleshooter. The wizard interface just isn't as smart as just selecting these checkboxes. So I usually do things manually. It's always a process of selecting an option, testing it. You got to test every feature a user might want to use. And if it doesn't work, going back and tweaking it and testing it again. So it just requires trial and error. But this can allow just about any app to work in Windows 8, even if it was designed for a really old operating system. Now, we're not going to go into detail in this lesson, but I will say that the ultimate compatibility mode is a virtual machine. Now, I like an app called VirtualBox. Some versions of Windows 8, Windows 8 Professional and Windows 8 Enterprise come with an app called Hyper-V. And Hyper-V allows you to run virtual machines. A virtual machine is an app that runs a version of Windows or another operating system in a window. So it's like Windows within a window. Hyper-V isn't great. It's the official Microsoft virtualization software, but I'm not a fan. VirtualBox here is completely free, and I like it much better. And in fact, this Windows 8 machine that you're looking at right now is running in a virtual machine within VirtualBox. So if I were to install VirtualBox on this machine and set up another virtual machine, it would be like some Inception style virtual machine in a virtual machine. but I wanted to show you the software. I suggest you download VirtualBox. For compatibility purposes, what you can do is install VirtualBox on a PC and then install Windows XP in a virtual machine. And if somebody needs to run a Windows XP app, they can fire up their virtual machine with Windows XP and run the app inside a window. But again, it shouldn't generally be necessary. So that wraps up how to use compatibility mode. Let's go on to the next sub-objective. Now we're going to learn to work with Windows Installer. Now everybody's installed a desktop app at some point. Usually you put the CD in or you download the setup file and there's an app named setup.exe. You double click it and you walk through the wizard and it installs the app, and that works fine. That's a great way to do it if you're sitting at a desk and you need to install an app. But in enterprises you have to install apps on hundreds or thousands of machines, and I know you're not going to want to go to every computer and double click setup.exe and click next through every one of the wizards. So there's a better way to install desktop apps, and it's called Windows Installer. So let's take a look at how to work with Windows Installer packages and how to repair them both on a one-by-one computer basis and in an enterprise with thousands of computers. This is my Windows 8 PC, and I've downloaded one of my favorite apps, VirtualBox. And this is the file you download when you go to install the Windows version of it. It's just an executable file, and if you double click it, the setup installer appears and you can walk through all the different steps to install it. So in an enterprise, you might want to work directly with the Windows installer files. So here are the Windows installer files for the same app. Now you'll see three different files here. One is this common file. You can see it's a cabinet file. Let me show the file extensions so you can see this a little more clearly. It has a .cab extension, and a cab file is exactly like a zip file. Basically, it's just one file that contains a bunch of smaller files, and there's some compression going on. So the common file, the common.cab file, isn't something you'll see with every Windows installer app, but it just happens to have some files that are shared between the two different Windows installer files that they provide. So the Windows installer files, what they call packages, have a .msi extension, as you can see here. And this is pretty common. They provide two different Windows installer packages, and you can tell the difference between them based on the file name. You can see this one ends in AMD 64, and this one ends in x86. And if you recall, x86 signifies 32-bit apps, while AMD 64 signifies a 64-bit app. You might also recall that a 32-bit version of Windows can only run 32-bit versions of apps. A 64-bit version of Windows can run either 64-bit or 32-bit versions of apps, but it's much better if you run 64-bit versions of apps on 64-bit Windows. So we can quickly check whether this is a 32-bit or 64-bit version of Windows, system type, 64-bit operating system. So that means for this computer, we'd want to install the 64-bit version. To install an MSI file manually, it's as easy as right-clicking it and clicking install. While I'm here, I'll show you a couple other shortcut items: repair and uninstall. It's that easy. That's what they do. If you already have the app installed and you think some file got corrupted, just select repair. If you're tired of it and you want to uninstall it, you can uninstall it from the package by just clicking uninstall. Though more than likely you'll go into the control panel uninstall tool and select it and uninstall from there, because every app you install with an MSI is automatically registered to be uninstalled in the same way. And in fact, when you install an app using a Windows installer package, Windows can automatically repair it because it keeps the original package around. Therefore, if it detects that a file is corrupted, it can go back to the MSI file and just use it to automatically repair it. So we're still on the install stage, so I'll pick install here. And lo and behold, the exact same wizard appears. This is exactly the same process that would happen if I just ran setup.exe. So by simply running the MSI file here, you don't see any difference at all. So what would be the benefit? Well, when you double click on it, it goes into an interactive installer by default. But you can also perform a completely automated installation using that same Windows installer file. So I'll copy this path to the clipboard so I can open it from a command prompt, because using the command prompt will make it easier for me to install it automatically. So at this command prompt, I will change directories to the directory that the MSI file is stored in. I'm using the cd command, which stands for change directory, and I'll just paste in the path that I want to be at. I'll run the directory command to make sure my files are there, and sure enough, they're here. Now, the tool I'm going to use to automatically install the Windows installer package is called MSI Exec, and it's built into Windows. Like most command line apps, if you want to see the parameters you can use with it, just type the name of the app and a dash, a question mark, or a slash question mark. This opens up the help file, basically showing you all the options that you can use. Now, the most important option is right here at the beginning. It's /i, which installs a product based on the MSI file name. You'll notice you can also use MSI Exec to uninstall an app by simply using a different parameter. Now, under the display options, there are a couple of important options here. For example, passive and quiet. These cause the install to happen without any administrative interaction at all. That's super, super useful. This means that you can set up a script or batch file to install the app with no interaction. And if you're going to be installing it on 1,000 computers, that's going to be really important because, again, even clicking next a few times is going to be really annoying if you got to do it 1,000 times. So you can use the MSI Exec tool to install it automatically. So let's do that now. Keeping in mind that while I'm running it from a command prompt, most of the time you're going to be running it from a script. /i indicates install, and I'll just copy the file name from over here so that I don't have to retype it. Paste it into the command prompt. And I'll give it the /quiet and /passive parameters so it does its thing automatically. Now you might be thinking, I didn't specify where to install the app or what installation settings to provide. Often there are ways to configure an individual app to install in non-default ways. If you just tell it, install it quietly, passively, it's going to accept all the defaults. Honestly, that works most of the time just fine. This app is a little unusual in that it wants to install a driver and that requires administrative credentials, but most Windows installer apps don't require anything. So you can see this is a Windows security dialog box. It's not happening as part of the installer. It's Windows catching it and saying, you don't have credentials for this. So I have to manually select it here. But in an automated environment, for most apps, you wouldn't see that happen. And it's installed. Apart from the one exception, which was unusual for this particular app, you can see that it's installed correctly without prompting me at all. Now I'll quickly show you how to uninstall that app using the control panel tool. From the start screen, I'm going to search for uninstall, and I'm going to search the settings. Now I'm going to go to uninstall a program. This is exactly like in earlier versions of Windows. It just lists all the installed apps. You can select something, and notice because it was installed with an MSI, I have the option to repair the program. Change here allows me to change any settings, such as where files are stored, and uninstall. Click that, and the app goes away. The nice thing about an MSI file is it tells Windows exactly how to install and uninstall the app. That's a requirement. You can't make a Windows installer package without also telling Windows how to remove it cleanly. Now, if you remember back in the old days, sometimes you installed an app and you went to uninstall it and it would leave all its files and it would leave some libraries hidden away that could later cause problems. Not so with Windows Installer. It goes on clean, you can always remove it. Windows Installer is great. Now, let's jump over to the Windows Server computer and I'll show you how to install an MSI package using Active Directory group policy settings so that you don't even have to log on to a computer or run a script. This is my Windows Server 2012 computer, and you can see here in the Downloads folder, I've downloaded a Windows Installer package. This is the Google Chrome MSI. Now, normally if you go to install Google Chrome, when you go to download it, they just give you an executable file because they figure you're just running it on your own computer. However, like most apps in the world, there's a Windows installer file available for it. So I just needed to do a separate search for Google Chrome MSI, and I found the MSI file. This is what an enterprise would need. Just about any app you can imagine, including all the biggies like Office, they're available to install from an executable file for an individual or a Windows installer package for an enterprise. So the MSI file is the enterprise version of it. Now, if you're going to install an MSI file on computers on a network, I can't have it come from my downloads folder on the local server. Instead, it needs to be accessible across the network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this into a shared folder. I'll move it over to the profiles folder here, which has conveniently been shared. You could certainly create a new share for it. And in the future, I'll access it through that share. Now, using group policy, this is the group policy management editor with the default domain policy currently being edited. Any settings I apply in this group policy object are going to be applied to every computer in my imaginary organization. There's one policy that's really useful for installing software. Under Computer Configuration, Policies, and Software Settings, there's this Software Installation node. So you can add a package to it by right-clicking it and then clicking Package. So I'm just going to type the name of the share here. Now this is the name of the computer that it's shared from, and the share was called Profiles $. Now we can see my MSI file here, and I'm accessing it across the network using the share name just like any computer would. Now, this exam doesn't go into a lot of detail about configuring group policy. That's more for the server exams. I just want you to be familiar with it. So you could go in and configure advanced settings here, but for now, we'll just assign the application, which means it will be installed on all computers that have the group policy applied to them, and click OK. So now imagine how well this works. By just picking that MSI file, every computer in my organization can suddenly have Chrome installed. I don't have to worry about whether the users have the privileges to install it, and I don't have to go to every single computer and run the executable. I don't have to provide the setup file to everybody or give people directions on how to install it or worry about them doing it wrong. The next time their computer applies group policy, this app is going to be installed on their computer with all the default settings or whatever settings I happen to apply. Now you'll notice that I applied it under Computer Configuration, Policies, Software Settings. There is another option. You can do the exact same thing under User Configuration. The difference is that the policy will apply to any users that are part of the group policy. Here, I'm assigning it to a computer. So whichever users are on that particular computer that's part of this group policy, they'll get the app. If you do it under User Configuration, you're assigning it to individual users, no matter which computer they're using. So to clarify, up here, specific computers, regardless of the users. Down here, specific users, regardless of the computers. So that wraps up how to manage apps using Windows installer files. Let's move on to the next sub-objective. So this sub-objective covers how to configure your default program settings. And it's kind of interesting because this came about as the result of a big lawsuit, an anti-monopoly lawsuit that various different governments had against Microsoft. It used to be that Microsoft just shipped every version of Windows with Internet Explorer and a bunch of other default Microsoft apps, and because Microsoft had established a monopoly legally with Windows, other competitors felt it was anti-competitive that they were also getting their browser forced on everybody who wanted to use Windows. So the government has forced Microsoft to make it easy for users to select non-Microsoft defaults. So let's take a look at how to do that. This is my Windows 8 computer, and I'm just going to search for defaults on the start screen, and you'll see one app comes up, Default Programs. This is a desktop app and control panel. And this last option down here, Set Program Access and Computer Defaults, opens up the tool that I need. Now, this tool gives you three options at a glance: Microsoft Windows, non-Microsoft, and custom. If you happen to select Microsoft Windows, this shows you what you get. You get Internet Explorer as your web browser, use your current email program, which is probably the Mail app. Windows Media Player becomes your media player. So I think you get the idea. All these default apps are going to be Microsoft's variety. Now, if you pick non-Microsoft, it's going to use whatever isn't a Microsoft app that happens to be installed on your computer. A lot of computer manufacturers might install their own media player, their own version of a browser, their own mail app even. So if you just wanted to use anything that wasn't Microsoft, you'd pick non-Microsoft. For most of us though, the right answer is going to be custom. Custom lets you pick and choose between Microsoft and non-Microsoft default apps. Now, for me, I prefer Google Chrome over Internet Explorer. I don't mind Windows Media Player, so maybe I would pick that. But you get to choose between the different apps that you have installed. Now, you have to have the app installed first, so maybe I prefer the VLC Media Player instead of Windows Media Player. But it's not installed on this computer, so it's not an option. I'd have to go and install it, and then it would become an option. So this is really straightforward. Just know where the tool is and how to find it, and that it exists. It makes it easy for users to pick Microsoft or non-Microsoft apps. Here's a closely related sub-objective: modify file associations. So let's jump back to Windows 8. And notice that I'm still in the default programs tool. There are a couple of different links I can use to change the file associations. Quickly, I'll demonstrate how this works. When you browse files in Explorer and you double-click a file, Windows knows which app to use to open the file based on a file association. So you can see that this is a picture I've taken. It has a .jpeg file extension. So when I double-click it, by default, it opens up in the Windows Store app, the Photos app. It's this nice full-screen immersive app, but it might not be the app that I want to use. For example, maybe I prefer the Windows Preview app. If I right-click it and click Preview, I get it to open here. But it's not the default. It requires a couple extra clicks, so it's really easy to change it so that when I double-click it, it opens up in the Windows Photo Viewer instead. I'll go back to the default programs tool here, and I'll click this first link, Set Your Default Programs. Now here you can see a list of programs that are installed on the computer. And here's the app I want to use, Windows Photo Viewer. Now there are two different ways I can configure which type of files the Windows Photo Viewer is used to open. The more customized is to click the second option, Choose Defaults for this program. And here I can go in and select the individual file extensions that I want to always open with Windows Photo Viewer, and then click Save. So when I switch back to Explorer and I double click it now, it opens up in Windows Photo Viewer instead of the Photos app. Another approach is to simply pick the app you want and then click Set this program as the default. You see it went from 4 out of 12 defaults to 11 out of 12 defaults. I guess it doesn't open up .gif files by default. So that's an app-first approach to changing the file associations. And if there's an app you know you want to use for everything, that's the way to do it. If you want to configure it on a file-by-file basis instead, click the second link, Associate a file type or protocol with a program. Here we see a list of different file extensions that are registered on the computer. You can see there are a lot of different file types. Just as an example, I'll scroll down to .jpg, which is really common for pictures, and you can see it's associated with the Windows Photo Viewer. If I want to change that, I can select it here and then click Change Program. And you can see there are 3 different apps that Windows, by default, can use to open pictures. So if I wanted to always edit it in the wonderful Paint app, I would select Paint here. And scrolling back to JPEG, we can see that it's associated with Paint. So I know you can guess what's going to happen now when I double click on it. It opens up in Paint, which would, I guess, allow me to paint in it. Now on this Associations tool, I'll scroll down a bit farther and we'll see something a little bit different. Protocols. Protocols work a lot like file extensions, except instead of basing it on a file name, they're basing it on a particular action, something that you're trying to do on the computer. And the one that you're most familiar with is going to be HTTP. So by default, any link that I open up that starts with HTTP, it's going to use Google Chrome. If I felt like using Internet Explorer, I could select it there, click Change Program, and then pick Internet Explorer. Now, HTTP is probably the only one that you'll ever want to use, but there are others. For example, if you click a mail link on a web browser, you might have a different app that you want to use to open mail links. It could be the built-in mail app, or it could be Exchange or Outlook or a variety of different apps. So you can set that here for individual users. So that's nice and straightforward. I'll show you quickly how you can do that using group policy. So let's switch over to Windows Server 2012. And this is my group policy object, the default domain policy, open in the group policy management editor. The settings I need are under computer configuration, and then preferences, and then control panel settings. Under folder options, I'll right click it, click anew, and then click file type. Now here I can specify a file extension and associated class if I want to do that. And then I can configure the class settings, such as an icon to display for JPEG files, and the action that I want to take place, which is basically to open it in a particular app. I would browse through here and pick the Windows Preview executable file. I don't expect that any of these specifics of this are going to be tested on the exam. I just wanted to show you this so that you knew you could specify it from group policy, because that's the only efficient way to get it done if you need to apply the settings to thousands and thousands of computers. So let's move on to the next sub-objective. The last sub-objective in this objective domain is manage AppV applications. AppV is an application virtualization technology. Basically, a user on a client computer can run an app on their computer. It'll basically just appear as an icon on their desktop, and their computer will connect to a server somewhere on their network and stream the app to them, or it can download the app directly to the computer across the network, kind of installing it on demand. So application virtualization is a different way to think about how to install apps. So far we've been talking about Windows installer files, where you need to either distribute it to all the computers or run it from each individual computer and the app gets installed locally. With application virtualization, you have the option to install the app on the server where it lives and is controlled. This gives you centralized management. The app is on the server, so you can have 10,000 clients connecting to it, but you only have to manage it in one place. And as you can imagine, that can make things really much more efficient in a big enterprise. So let's take a look at our Server 2012 computer and what is in these AppV packages. So the app you see here is the Microsoft Application Virtualization Sequencer. This is where it all starts. Now, when you install an application locally, you use a Windows installer file. And application packages use Windows Installer too, but they have some extra components. You can download the Application Virtualization Sequencer from Microsoft, but in order to use AppV, you're going to need a software assurance license. That's the special license that enterprises get with Microsoft. So I'll click here to create a new virtual application package. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because the certification exam wants you to be familiar with how the apps work and the basics of managing them, but they don't really expect you to know the ins and outs of creating the packages. So I'm going to go through it quickly enough that you'll be familiar with it, but I don't expect you to know every aspect of it. Now, you can create an app package manually where you specify basically everything that makes up the app and how it should run and be configured where it's going to be accessed on the network. Or if you're smart, you'll use a package accelerator. All you need to do is search the internet for AppV package accelerator and the name of the app that you're looking for, and you'll probably find somebody's already made it and accelerated for it. If it's a common app, that's definitely true. So every Adobe app, every Microsoft app, there's accelerators for, and these accelerators have all the settings that would go into a package pre-configured for you. You just need to provide the executable file and a couple of other choices. So I'm going to select an accelerator here. I downloaded an accelerator and saved it into this folder. This is the accelerator for Adobe Reader. Now, you might recall that CAB files are really just files that contain a bunch of other files, and if you were to look into this CAB file, you would see a whole set of files that make up the accelerator, a bunch of text files. Now, the accelerators are pretty nice. As you can see here, it's got basically a README file. This file has a whole bunch of information about how to put together the package. And if you scroll down, it tells you which platforms it runs on, any requirements. It even gives you a direct link to where you can get the executable file. Adobe Reader is completely free, makes it rather easy to get. Sometimes you're going to need licensed software, and of course you need to get that through your software vendor. One of the things it requires is an MSI file for Adobe Reader, and Adobe Reader is typically distributed as an executable file. Now you'll notice here they give you parameters that you can use to extract the MSI file from the executable file. This is a pretty common technique. When you download an application installer, it'll be an executable file, but really it's just an executable file that contains an MSI file. So there's a Windows installer package hidden inside that exe file. You just have to extract it. So we can read through these instructions and follow them. Now in this page, it's asking me to select the installation files. This is wanting me to specify the MSI file that I downloaded earlier. So this is the folder that contains it, and I'll click next. Now it prompts me for the application package name. And this is the folder that it's going to save the package to. And of course, there's the option to compress the package here. This is really important. Just leave it selected. Application virtualization downloads the application over the network, and you don't want the user waiting forever while it downloads. So the smaller it is, the more compressed it is, the better. So now it's creating the package for me. Now here, you can choose to configure the software. And if you do that, it's going to actually run the app. I'll demonstrate it for you. Now, Reader is really simple. It doesn't require any configuration, so it's going to go really smoothly. But some applications, when you run them, they're going to prompt you to set up the application and choose configuration settings. You're basically picking the defaults for any users who will be streaming this app. So now it's prompting me to run the app. I'll select it and then run selected. And you'll just see that the app appears. Like I was saying, if it were something more complex than Adobe Reader, something that required configuration, then I could go in and configure it and it would remember the settings. And basically, you're running it for the first time for the user so that they don't have to deal with configuration the first time they run it. So now you can see it's saving the package out. And once this is all saved, we'll go in and take a look at the package so we can see the files that make up the package. So that saved it onto my desktop, and I'll just dig in here. This is the AppV package, and you can see a set of files in here. I bet you recognize that one, an MSI file. This is exactly like the MSI files that you distributed and installed earlier in this lesson. And in fact, it behaves exactly that way. It's that easy to distribute AppV apps, provided you have the right server infrastructure installed. Now, the most important file here is the SFT file. Notice that it's really big. That's because the SFT file actually contains the application executable. When a desktop user runs the AppV app, it's going to connect to that SFT file and pull down just the parts of the app that it needs. Typically, this is about 20 to 40% of the entire app. So this app is about 100 megabytes. You can count on the user downloading 20 to 40 megabytes when they run the app. That's a lot smaller than installing the whole app, especially if that's something that the user doesn't run on a regular basis. For something like Adobe Reader, it's fairly lightweight and users probably use it pretty often. So you might be better off actually installing that on all the clients, but you wouldn't get that centralized manageability and you wouldn't get the install on demand. Another file here is the SVRJ file. This is the AppV project file. You can edit this to allow you to make modifications to this package. The OSD file has configuration information about the app. as does this manifest file. So whoever puts together the package might go in and change these to specify the server that it runs from. Like I said, that's kind of outside the scope of this exam. So beyond this and the server infrastructure, AppV apps are managed pretty similarly to other apps, but you have to keep some things in mind. When an administrator deploys an AppV app to clients, you're going to see an icon on the desktop just like you would any other app. But when you go to run it, it's going to download or stream the app to the client computer depending on the settings. So the different behaviors are going to change the user's experience some. If the app is streamed, it's going to be pretty responsive. It's going to respond pretty quickly, assuming they have decent bandwidth. And if everything is working okay, if their internet connection is fine, they won't notice anything different. It'll just start up the app. If the app is configured to download to their computer, there's going to be a bit of a delay while the entire thing downloads. The more bandwidth they have, the quicker that's going to be. So everything should be fine, but we all know that problems can occur. For example, if the user's internet connection is really slow, the app is going to open really slow. Sometimes users get frustrated and they try to close it down. So if that happens, you need to be aware that it's an AppV app, and you can say, you might want to run this from Wi-Fi the first time, or just be patient with it and let it run for a couple of minutes. It will appear eventually. If a user wants to run an AppV app and they don't have a connection to your network, they might have an internet access, but they don't have a connection to the internal network, they won't be able to do it, not the first time. If it's set up to stream from the server, they're going to need to connect to the server every single time they do it. Now, the server administrators will typically only configure an app to stream like that for desktop computers that are pretty continuously connected to the network. For mobile computers that are often used offline, you have to rely on your server administrators to configure it properly and intelligently. So it shouldn't generally be an issue. That's something that's outside of the scope of the exam, that is choosing the different types of AppV deployments. But for this desktop-centric exam, I just want you to know that AppV apps often run from the server, and if they can't contact the server, if the user doesn't have an internet connection, or if they don't have a connection to the internal network, it's simply not going to work. They're going to get an error message. And the way to solve that is to get them connected to the network, to talk to the AppV administrators and get them to change the way the app runs for that user, or to install the app manually on the user's local computer. This is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and I hope you found the lesson both educational and enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.